Thank you for joining us today on today's discussion on the pitfalls in development mining project and measures to mitigate. I'll be your host, Sule from Core, but we have Mark with us, who is an associate director from Wardell Armstrong, leading today's discussion. Before handing it over to Mark, quick format of today's webinar. Mark will be delivering a 15 to 17-minute presentation, and that's when we practice it. And then we'll go to question and answers, or you can just drop in your questions in the webinar chat, and I'll be monitoring it as we go along. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. So I guess I should share my screen. As Celia said, I've got a few slides to go through. Some of them will go through quite quickly, and you're welcome to ask questions at any time. So let me, without further ado, try. Great. Okay, so as Suleiman said, this is the pitfalls of developing a mining project. It's quite generic. As we said, we've got 25-30 minutes for this presentation, so there's plenty of time for questions, hopefully. And I'll try not to go too quick or talk too quickly. So without further ado. So I'm Associate Director from Wardell Armstrong. I've got about 25 years experience working mainly in Africa in a variety of commodities: copper, cobalt, gold, uranium, graphite, rare earths, and as well as Africa, I've also worked in CIS countries, etc. And as usual, we Wardell Armstrong write reports ranging from desktop studies all the way through scoping, pre-feasibility, feasibility studies. The only thing Wardell Armstrong don't do is we don't build mines, but everything else we do. So that's a bit about Wardell Armstrong. This presentation is basically 3 parts: an overview, then modifying factors, and then some case studies, and then lastly a few lessons learned. Okay, so what are investors looking for? Investors are typically looking for, as you can see, good prospects for success, countries with a track record of mining, and those countries, that list of countries is growing from, you know, your typical South Africa, Zambia, Congo, Ghana, to include your Malis, your Burkina Fasos, Cote d'Ivoire, etc., etc. So that's obviously very Africa focused. They're looking for countries with low risk. Typically that used to only be low risk would be, say, political risk or financial risk. I think that's now growing to include security risk, especially in West Africa. But that's something maybe we can touch on later. Safe commodities with well-defined markets. Obviously, gold is always a very popular project to look at, but you know, you have a whole range of projects in Africa. It's very well endowed, and a good project will typically find money and find investors. Yeah, so that can be a range of different products. Transparency in legislation. Companies want to know what the risks are, what the mining law is, how long they have to have mining title for, and obviously how also they can get the money out, the profits out, once they pay the taxes. You know, you do also want to understand what your capital costs, how poor, how good is the infrastructure, etc., etc., and ultimately mining is the business of making money. This is obviously a map of the world. On here there are a summary of the various different mining codes. Now, when me as a geologist or my colleagues as mining engineers or metallurgists will write a scoping study report or a feasibility report, we typically do it according to a mining code. Quite often that is according to the JORC code, which is under Australasia, but that's very popular also in Africa, mainly due to lots of Aussies having worked, I think, in Africa. But you have other popular codes, the SIM code in Canada, under which you have your NI 43-101 reports. People sometimes think that their reports are written to the NI 43-101 code. That's not true. It's the SIM code. And the NI 43-101 report is a format under that code. But you have other codes. In South Africa, you've got SAMRAC. In Russia, you've got PERC, etc., etc. So all these various codes. Something else to consider with mining projects is there's about 206 countries, so they're also all competing for investment. So the fiscal regime within those countries is also as important, perhaps, as the actual project people are working on. Okay, so what are the various mine life cycle stages? Starting from your exploration planning here, where your expenditure is typically low. Hopefully everybody can see my cursor. But where your risk is high, and then you go through to maybe your reconnaissance exploration, a little bit of drilling through to your more target defined drilling, through to your definition drilling. At this stage, you'd probably define your mineral resource estimate and your ore reserves with the feasibility study being completed. And once that's done, and you've raised the funds to kick off a project, obviously you have huge spike in your capital expenditure with a commensurate dip in your risk, obviously through to your mining and reclamation. So those are your typical stages. And if people are looking into investment, quite often they'll be looking at this sort of side of the equation to try to get multiples on their investment. But at the same time, as soon as you go into production, you can typically get an uptick in share price of companies here as well. But it really does depend upon project by project. I've mentioned a couple of items, a couple of words, terminology. So we have a scoping study. This is where, let's say you've got a gold project or a copper project, and you might try to decide, is this going to be an open pit or underground? Are you going to use flotation? Are you going to use leaching? So at this stage, you typically look at 2 or 3 or 4 different methods to mine, to process, to whatever. So this is what a project could be. So you develop concepts and see if it makes sense, see if it passes the smell test, see if it arguably could make money. Then a pre-feasibility study. This should be what the project should be. She'll assess and rank options. So typically you'll have maybe 2 different scenarios, 2 different options in mining or metallurgy, and then you'll determine what is the best. And then your feasibility study, now you're declaring to your investors, you're declaring to the stock exchanges, this is what we're going to do. This is the methodology that we're going to use. And then stage 4, you've got your actual implementation, your breaking of ground, construction of the plant, etc., etc. So you'll actually be constructing, commissioning, and then finally you've got your stage 5, where you're actually operating the mine. This is where you're actually extracting the metal or the mineral and selling it, and that's when you're getting the money back, hopefully. And then obviously you've got closure, demolition, rehabilitation, and hopefully even business development for the local community. Okay, what are modifying factors? And for those people who don't know, under let's say the JORC code, you have to consider what are those areas that might impact a project negatively. So you've got your typical main areas, your geology, mineral resources, hydrogeology or hydrology as well, geotechnical studies, mineral processing studies, environmental, and a couple of areas that I haven't covered here, mine design and financial analysis. If, as an example, you've worked on a project for 3 years and spent $10–20 million on it, but you haven't done a geotechnical study to the correct level, that can present a risk. And as such, because that is a modifying factor that could affect the project, until that is done to, let's say, pre-feasibility study level, you won't be able to declare typically all reserves. So all these areas would need to be covered in sufficient detail to give you confidence that you can understand the risks and mitigate them. Okay, so looking at geology, mineral resources. So this is some I'm going to get into the case studies now. So this is an African gold project. Previously, drilling campaigns were based on wide space drilling grids, and that could be anywhere from 75 meters, 100 meters plus. And that was insufficient to define the main structural controls of the mineralization. Gold projects typically structurally controlled, so it's important to understand that. Because of that wide space drilling, there was low confidence in the structural interpretation, and that meant when the mineral resource geologist who estimated this particular project, they classified the mineral resource estimate at an inferred level. So it's not just the drill spacing, but it's the confidence that that spacing, the geological, the structural, even the alteration understanding, all of that would come into play when you're classifying a mineral resource estimate. So because it was classified at inferred, as I mentioned earlier, to progress to a feasibility study or a pre-feasibility study and to declare all reserves, you have to be able to have everything in terms of the geological side at measured or indicated. So just for those people who don't know, under the geology side, going from highest classification to lowest under the JORC code, you would have measured as the highest, then indicated, then inferred. And to equate that, although it doesn't quite equate your geology, your measured would typically be proven and your indicated would be probable. Your inferred mineral resources effectively fall away. They're not counted from the mining side because of the high level of risk or the low level of confidence there. So because of that lack of structural understanding, this particular project was delayed. So therefore additional drilling was done. This was 20-40 meter drill spacing, and that allowed that reinterpretation of the geology and the structure, and that increased confidence then allowed the classification to be increased from inferred to indicated, and then the indicated mineral resources to be classified as probable or reserves. So that's a typical example of how you have to get your drilling and your confidence high enough to declare mineral resources and leading on to that all reserves. Okay, this is case study B, which was a FTSE 100 mining company. The company was in the process of listing. It was an operating mine that was actually extracting from the inferred mineral resource areas. This isn't untypical. In fact, it can be done. Sometimes inferred mineral resources can be mined as waste effectively, but when they do grade control drilling, they discover that actually there's a bit of ore there, so they would stockpile it or whatever. And they were actually making money from mining this area, but because it was inferred, the competent person was unable to sign it off as an ore reserve. Now, mining operations can be different in the sense that if you're mining, if the competent person is able to demonstrate why and how, it might be possible that some inferred material can be used in the mining plan, and as such declared as an ore reserve. But that would typically be, let's say, a 20-year life of mine for an iron project, and the last 2-3 years is inferred. So you would include it in a mine plan and the financials. But that's because you've got a long lead time to get to those areas. In this particular instance, they were actually mining the inferred more at the start. So therefore, zero value in this particular instance was attributed to the project valuation and that ore reserve estimate. And more drilling had to be done, unfortunately. So that's that case study B. Stop me if any questions come in, Sully. Case study C, CAS mining company, they wanted to raise finance in the international markets. They had both inferred and indicated mineral resource estimates. Quite common for CIS Russian countries to have a lot of what they call C2, which would typically 50% of it would become inferred. But in this particular instance, only 2 years of that 20-year life of mine, so 10%, only 10% of it was indicated, so 90% of it was inferred. So again, not acceptable under the JORC code to be classified as an ore reserve. Therefore, that impacted upon the financials. So they couldn't include it in the financials, so the capital couldn't be paid back. So therefore, they had to again take up additional drilling to upgrade that inferred to indicated. So it's not an issue that can't be overcome, but it does cost money and take time and delay. So so that was the situation there. So that's the geology and resources. So now hydrogeology. This was a case study, again, in the Russia CIS countries. Wardell Armstrong, as well as doing a lot of work in Africa, we do a lot of work in CIS countries, Russia. This project, the scoping study progressed straight through to feasibility study, so they missed a couple of levels, a couple of steps. And the hydrogeology issues weren't identified at the scoping study. That isn't isn't atypical, again, because a scoping study is a very early stage. So you can miss things if you don't have those additional steps in. They also had the issue that an adjacent mine had historical issues with water control, and that was unfortunately the estimate here. And when Wardell did their own studies, we estimate it take 3 years to dewater the mining area, which was an additional cost and delay again. Because of that, this particular project was stalled and basically shelved because of that. And again, unfortunately, they jumped too quickly from that scoping study level to feasibility study level. If we look at a geotechnical example, again, SAS country, they had all reserves. An all reserve estimate was required to be done by the client. Unfortunately, they drilled their geotechnical holes vertically, which typically are impossible to calculate your dip direction, your alpha beta angles, unless, as I've got written here, indented, unless you utilize optical or acoustic telemetry, which is a tool that has a gyroscope and it knows where north is at all times, and it goes down a hole. You typically have a medium of a water in there, and it would spin around and effectively map the outside of your drill hole and then calculate your alpha beta angles for you. But the client didn't do that. They had vertical holes, therefore their geotechnical design was limited, so they were lacking data. So that meant that there were unresolved issues, and again, further work was required, and again, more drilling was required. All of that is increased costs and delays, and not obviously what the client wanted to hear, but that's the reality of what we had to deal with. Okay, this is a Middle Eastern company. They wanted again an all reserve, but in this particular instance, the geotechnical core was spun and it wasn't corrected, so therefore we were unable to determine those important alpha and beta angles that would give you that structural information. Hence, the data couldn't be used. And again, the project was delayed until those issues were resolved. Spun core isn't uncommon. This can happen with drillers trying to drill too fast. It's less of an issue with if you're doing drilling for assays, although it can still be an issue. But where you've got geotechnical drilling, you do want that to be slower, typically larger diameter, inclined, and the geologist in question should have stopped the drill in this instance. But again, that's the situation that we came across. Okay. If we look at mineral processing, some modifying factors, again, SAS country, they had done some mineral processing tests, but no variability testing. The client's geologist had identified core in line with variability testing criteria, but they packaged them into one test sample, which wasn't what our laboratory wanted. That again led to additional samples being required and testing to be repeated. Not all of this is rocket science. It can be quite simple. You'd wonder why sometimes these mistakes happen, but they do happen when people are under pressure or maybe lacking experience, or just mistakes are made. So these are just some examples that we're giving you. This was an example actually in Europe. Some people might actually be able to guess which particular mine I'm talking about, but anyway, this particular mine, they did mineral pre-processing tests where I actually worked on this particular project, but the samples were not representative, and it wasn't recognized that they weren't representative. But when I said I worked on this project, I worked on this project more recently, not at this phase. The client unfortunately relied upon old reports, and they took the good bits out of the report, but they ignored the negative aspects. There was also assumptions made on the mineralogy, which meant that when the plant was designed and built, the minerals were basically aggressively ground and effectively lost to the tailings before they got into the plant properly. So the project just failed basically, and again, more testing was recommended, and Wardell Armstrong is currently working with this client to do more metallurgical testing, and hopefully second time round the project will be successful. I'm just looking at time now, we're okay. Environmental, this is an area that typically gets looked at last, unfortunately. Proactive management of these so-called non-technical risks of environmental health, safety, social, all of those aspects, your so-called social license to operate, very, very important, becoming more and more important. Communities are becoming a lot more vocal in their opposition to projects or wanting their cut of the pie, shall we say. And a recent study from the World Bank, 35% of delays came from environmental concerns, but 42% delays from social opposition. With your Facebooks and your WhatsApp and all the rest of it, it's very easy for people to communicate both accurate information and let's say allow bad players to also have their own agendas. So trying to get these so-called non-technical risks reduced early on will save a lot of time and effort. This was a project Wardell Armstrong was asked to undertake a due diligence on an iron ore project as part of signing off on a feasibility study. There was a lot of local projects, local reports done, and Wardell Armstrong had to review them and collate them into an overall report. Unfortunately, in terms of the environmental, there was a lack of baseline data. There was no social data, there was limited impact data, and there was no reclamation or closure planning. So we designed a baseline studies and fast-tracked a report, but that would have required 12 months to complete. So imagine if you're a project director and you go to the board of directors, you say, oh, sorry, we've got a year's delay. You might be looking for another job fairly soon. So fairly significant delays and additional costs here. This is an African junior mining company. They actually did comply with the local laws, although they missed the social aspects, but they then wanted to raise money internationally, which then meant everything had to be in accordance with IFC standards and equator principles. In this particular instance, the difference between what was required and what they hadn't done wasn't that big, so it was a 3-month program, 3-month delay to enable them to uplift what they'd done to the correct standards. So that was a more positive review and enabled them to do what they needed to do. Okay, so I have gone through fairly quickly, but I think that was the plan. So what are the lessons learned? Work closely with your consultant from the start to ensure any fatal flaws are identified and overcome. And when I say fatal flaws, issues, all the issues you've heard earlier. Start early with the EIA and social programs, involve the community, involve the government, give feedback regularly. An extra cost earlier on can prevent costly delays later on. So spend a few pennies now and save a few dollars later on. Something important, tailor your work programs to the ultimate report. Are you producing a JORC report or are you producing a SIM NI 43101 report? They can have important differences. And again, verify your historical drilling and reports. Quite often there's lots of projects that have been drilled before, and if a project's got 200 drill holes on it, you might want to drill 10 or 20 of those as twins. So you have to do your own verification and drilling and checking. And obviously don't cherry pick the old reports. There might be some bad news in those reports. You have to determine those. And as a guy I used to work for always used to, his saying was assume nothing, check everything, follow up. So that's essentially, thank you very much. Anybody needs to get hold of me, that's my email address. Very quickly run through. Sully,
Nice.
over to you.
Yeah, we actually had a few questions come in, so let me have a look.
Okay.
Well, one of the questions is someone is developing a project in Sudan, and they're wondering if, due to the lack of water, they should pick a particular mineral to develop rather than, I believe, maybe gold.
I suppose gold projects typically can be a lot smaller, and you could arguably pre-concentrate up to, let's say, from your run of mine, up to 20 or 30 grams a ton, and then truck it somewhere else and have a plant closer to where water is. You could do some leaching. There are a number of issues, but yeah, water is a serious issue. I know that what they call First Quantum, they have their big gold project in Mauritania. I think they have desalination plants at the coast and pipeline their water 30 kilometers away or something. I'm also aware of another project in Niger, a uranium project, where they're also having to transport water about 30k. So is an issue. Typically it's something that can be overcome with additional infrastructure, both capital costs and operating costs.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I think that's answered. And then we have another question on the topic of the day, coronavirus.
Oh, yes.
if it will be difficult to raise capital for projects. What do you think about that?
Yes and no. I'm actually personally working with a couple of projects in Guinea, and I know one project that recently raised a fair bit of money. I think with current times, people with money are looking to place their money in projects. Some people, especially who've got money made, let's say, from oil and gas, they probably wouldn't invest in oil and gas now, so they're looking to diversify and look at other projects. Any good project, I think, still can raise money. This particular project, won't name who it is or where it is, they've been talking to people for a good 6 to 9 months now to raise money. So it's not like you can go to somebody and say, oh, I need £500,000 or £1 million, and they give you a check next week. It's typically a long process. You have to talk to many people over a long period of time. So I think coronavirus is it already impacting some mines? And I'm aware of some of the copper cobalt mines in Zambia and DRC where they've had expats come back and bring coronavirus with them, unfortunately, and hence anybody, when they discovered that, when they had that person had to self-isolate and all the other people had to self-isolate. Some of these projects are quite small, so if you have half of your technical team self-isolating, that can impact your operations. So I think it will impact things personally, but I'm a big gold bull. I don't see gold going down anytime soon. I think people are still looking to do something with their money. Those people have money. The earlier stage projects may struggle more, but even some of those, if they got a good enough story, you find the right investor, you can still find investors. But it won't be as easy as I think it maybe has been, and it will take longer than you think.
Okay. And how about you as a company? Has Wardell Armstrong been affected by coronavirus?
We have been affected. We have, I mean, Wardell Armstrong International, we're sort of the mining, geology, metallurgy, geotech, hydrology team. We've got 50, 70 people, whatever it is, but we're part of a larger group that's got 100 people. The larger group, we have furloughed about 10, 20% of our staff, and some of our other staff are maybe cut down their hours a bit or taking a few days leave. But we are very fortunate that we have some big projects that have been ongoing and will be ongoing for the next year. I'm personally involved in about 2 or 3 projects in West Africa. Some of them are winding down and some of them will be going for another 3-4 months. But we have other projects that are going for another year. So hopefully by then we'll be up and running. And as I said, just in answer to the other question, we are being involved in some due diligence work. A lot of that is desktop work because we can't do any site visits at the moment, although we do have quite a few associates in various countries. So we can organize site visits in some jurisdictions if it's a jurisdiction where we have someone we worked with in the past. And we do have offices in Kazakhstan and in Russia. So yeah, we are busy in that sense, and hopefully soon, as and when and if we're able to travel, then we'll be able to do those site visits and the normal work.
Before moving forward to the next question, if I may add on COVID-19, we're actually having a special seminar, a webinar on it on Thursday that looks at with a case study in Zimbabwe and look at the impact of coronavirus in mining investment in the country. So we'll send out invites to register for that one. Moving swiftly. Right, one question from Welcome is, what's your take on investing in gold? Because you said you were very bullish about gold earlier.
I am, but I've been bullish in gold for about 10 years. So I was expecting gold to be higher than it was many years ago, and been proven to be wrong. Look, in times of uncertainty, gold is always, people rush to it as a store of value. The amount of gold produced every year is typically 2.5 tons a year. So it's not one of those commodities that has a huge variety in the amount produced every year. But it is one of those ones that always excites people on a good project. You have seen, there's very few projects that have 20 grams of ton of gold. A lot of your open pits now are the 1 to 2.5 grams per ton of gold, and obviously you do get gold produced in as a byproduct within, say, porphyry coppers or other projects. But personally, I think gold is still got a lot to do. Hopefully, copper cobalt recovers a bit, and I think it will have to if the amount required, according to the projections for the battery metals, and electric vehicles projections are to be found to be true. So yeah, I'm very confident or positive about gold, but there are many other projects that are positive. You know, uranium has recently spiked up quite a bit. You know, your other battery metals, people forget that I think Elon Musk famously said that the lithium cobalt battery shouldn't be called lithium cobalt. They should be called nickel graphite, because there's more of those in there. So, you know, your nickel, your graphites, and then I presented at a conference in January where somebody, don't know if it was their phrase, but they coined a phrase: tin is the glue that holds these batteries together. Lead is no longer used as solder, it's tin. Tiny amounts, but you have to have it to put these things together. And there's not that many large tin projects. There is one, South Crofty. The feasibility studies are being done or redone down here in Cornwall. So yeah, there's lots of projects that have got potential commodities.
I mean, the uptick in uranium, what would you put that down to?
I think that is a very complicated area that I don't know a lot about. I've looked at a few podcasts. There's one, Crux Investor, where they've had a guy on there a few times explaining about it. I think there's various different types of uranium market. There's the uranium that's mined, and then that uranium is then processed into another project, and then it's processed again. And those sort of middle processed stockpiles, for want of a better phrase, have depleted a lot. And it's a very opaque market, and in that the people who are using, the end users, compared to the people who process it and the miners before that, they want to have these long-term contracts, because obviously when you build a hugely, hideously expensive nuclear power plant, you want to have your supply, your fuel guaranteed. And when a few of these suppliers refuse to sign long-term contracts under the terms offered, then the terms have to be improved. So there's a whole reason about that I'm probably not qualified to talk too much about, but I think it's been coming a long time, and I don't think it's going to go south anytime soon either.
Right, and we have a question from Anthony. He's asking, out of interest, what is the most common issue you come across when dealing as a CP? E.g., is it over-reliance on drilling, no environment or social studies, or other issues you've mentioned?
As a geologist, one of the most frustrating things is companies will have their SOPs, their standard operating procedures.
Yeah.
So they will typically say in their standard operating procedure for their QAQC, the quality assurance, quality control, we will insert 5% insertion rate, or 10%, or 20%, or whatever it is. And there's nothing worse than a company not doing what they said they're going to do. Now, if they say they're going to have a 3% insertion rate of their QAQC, so standards, blanks, duplicates, I might disagree, and I say, oh, that 3% isn't high enough, it should be X amount. But their standard is their standard. The worst for me, the worst thing is them not actually doing what they said they're doing. That's number one. And then number two, I suppose, typical things. I've seen some very low grade projects where people haven't bothered to top cut. And for me, that's just poor science. So typically, when you have a gold project or a copper project, whatever it is, you will have some very, very high values. You will cut those down to a certain level that is statistically justified. But sometimes some people say, oh, it's a low grade anyway, we don't need to top cut. So those would be my probable two bugbears.
And one more question, I guess.
Should ask Anthony what his issues are, seeing as he's also a geologist who I've known for about 20 years.
Sure, Anthony, if you want to join us.
That's okay. I think you did an excellent job of going through that, Mark. Thank you. I mean, I suppose from my point of view, yeah, just similar. I mean, we do similar work, obviously, and I was just interested, really, what your experiences were. But yeah, I would agree that we have similar experiences, and the lack of QAQC procedures, I suppose, is the biggest one that we come across, and then also people failing, I think, to understand, and I think probably in more recent times, people failing to understand the importance and significance of undertaking environment and social assessments at an early stage. There's nothing worse than seeing a really good mineral deposit never actually being developed because the local community is turned against them because they weren't brought into the process at an early stage. It's a great shame, and it can be so easily mitigated by involving the community and talking to them and involving them and getting them on side.
That's right.
So yeah, from my perspective, that's some of our crimes, if you like.
Yeah, and I suppose the other one, and doesn't matter how good a company is, especially when a project has gone through 2 or 3 or 4 different companies' hands, because there's a good rule of thumb: the third company finds the mine. You will have historic data, and putting all that together in a proper database is also an area that's fraught with issues. There's always issues with databases, but yeah, you just get on with it. Any more questions, Sully?
Oh yeah, we have a few, and maybe this might be for someone who is currently in Africa, working in Africa, if he can share their experience. Someone is asking, how are people communicating and continuing business in Africa currently?
Yeah, emails works well. I mean, Zoom, WhatsApp. I really like WhatsApp. It's very easy to communicate videos. Skype, obviously, of course, but yeah, Zoom. We also have Wardell. We have Microsoft Teams. So there's a whole raft of issues. It's interesting that some of our clients' technical staff are actually, because the flight restrictions both in the countries they're from, say Australia or South Africa or wherever else, plus the countries they want to go back to return to, they can't return back. So they themselves are also remote working from home with their own mine sites. So yeah, technology is great. I mean, if this was 10, 15 years ago, phone bills would be sky high, or who knows what would happen, you know?
That's true. And maybe to finish up on some positivity, have you seen any, as a company, or Anthony, I'll open this to you as well, any new opportunities as a result of COVID-19?
From a mining point of view, I think it's probably companies are really going to realize which staff are very adaptable and which staff can work under pressure, either because they have to stay on site longer than they planned, or those staff that can still do their job remotely. It's also going to give companies the opportunity to do some basic sort of research work, sort out the databases, as I mentioned earlier, or work on other areas. So yeah, all of those aspects, and it's going to force companies to work with what they have. So if all of a sudden, you know, they've got a supplier in China or wherever trying to supply them a part, and they can't get that for obvious reasons, then they'll have to find a workaround. So I think miners, people in the mining industry, are generally very versatile, and they'll do what they have to. You know, if a mining engineer, you know, if they've got a big problem, they hit it with a hammer. If they've got a bigger problem, they find a bigger hammer to hit it with. That's usually their answer. But the rest of us, we have to, you know, use our grey matter, and yeah, adapt and change. I think it is going to tell people that you know, it's not just can you find a mine, can you mine it, can you process it, can you get out of the country. Is there that supply? I mean, China has sort of shut down all its manufacturing, so there's less of a demand all of a sudden. Is that going to impact positively or negatively going forward on the electric vehicle market? I don't know. I think people have assumed that they'll be able to get enough copper and cobalt out of the ground. I suspect that that's not going to be the case. I also suspect that this whole situation is going to push everyone's projections in terms of the electric vehicle demand out for 6, 12, 18 months. So there's maybe some negatives there. But hopefully, I think governments are going to really have to try to stimulate certain sectors, perhaps the building industry, and that will give an obvious demand in your cement, but also your copper and your steel. I think those are areas that I'd hope would be changed or implemented, and obviously your gold in times of uncertainty. I think gold producers are still going to attract that interest.
Thank you. Anthony, you have something to add?
Not too much really. Mark's summarized it very well. I mean, from our perspective, from an SRK perspective, I would say the type of work that we're currently doing is changing a little bit in response to the travel restrictions. So we're doing, as I'm sure Mark is, a lot more desk-based work, a lot more remote sensing type of work. So using a lot more specialist pieces of software to interpret satellite data, which is still, still freely available. Of course, you don't need to travel anywhere to use satellite data to understand the prospectivity of an area. We're doing a lot more things like machine learning, I suppose, as well, mineral systems approach. So fundamental conceptual studies looking at the prospectivity of large areas or smaller areas. So we're doing a lot more of that, but that's in response to the travel restrictions that's affecting the entire industry, of course. Yeah, but I agree with Mark's earlier comment in terms of you find out how adaptable your staff can be, I suppose, and who's making the best of the time at the moment in these difficult circumstances, and who, I suppose, perhaps could be a little bit more adaptable, shall we say. It's challenging for everybody. Everybody's in the same position, weathering the same storm, but perhaps not in the same boat. I'm sure that circumstances will ultimately change, of course, but it means that whilst these restrictions are ongoing, exploration doesn't need to stop. It's still stuff that people can get on with by doing all these things like remote sensing and planning for future drilling campaigns or whatever, so that when the restrictions are lifted, we're able to carry on. Now, what that future scenario looks like, of course, remains to be seen, but the world is still going to need commodities. There's going to be no shortage of people out there who are looking for projects and wanting to invest. It might be a little bit more difficult to get that investment, as Mark was saying earlier on, but exploration is an ongoing business and will remain so. It can take years before mines are developed from initial exploration projects, and the sooner that starts, the better, really. So that's our perspective, I suppose. But thanks to Mark for a very interesting and engaging talk. And yeah, hopefully in better times we'll be able to meet up again.
Absolutely. Suleiman, I saw there was one question here from Sandawana about what's your take on investing in gold in South African gold dumps. That's actually quite an interesting one. I have a little bit of experience with that, but not a huge amount. Gold dumps, I think, are one of those areas that, especially historic gold dumps, can have a significant potential for gold, because the old timers didn't obviously understand or have the technology we have now. So people can reprocess gold dumps and make money. You do have to get proper representative samples of it to then test and process. Another area that may or may not be applicable, I suspect less so, but it is something to look at, are ore sorters. So an ore sorter would be able to take a stream of ore, typically a very small size, and based upon any sort of criteria from color to specific gravity to other properties, kick out waste and to one side and ore to another, and in so doing you will upgrade your ore stockpile. That's something that's being used a lot recently in tin tungsten projects, but many other projects as well. So if you have a waste that's say a white colored rock typically, and another rock, black rock that's got your ore in it, you can ore sort that simply in color, get rid of 90% of your waste and keep the rest, and in so doing uplift your grade, and in so doing make it more profitable to mine. So metallurgy is a whole black art on its own, but there have been recent both developments and improvements on known technology, because ore sorters have been around for a while. So that would be my perhaps more full answer to that question.
Okay, let me bring Welcome in, because he's raising his hand up. Welcome.
Okay.
Hi, do you want something to add? Do you have something to add?
Well, thanks, Mark and Sol, for a wonderful program that you have just pinned. Yeah, the reason why I'm asking that, we've got huge dams in South Africa of gold dams, but the challenge is that, you know, there isn't anybody who has come up with a process of reclaiming these dams, because they've been reclaimed now and then. You go in and test these dams, you still
Sure.
find significant amount of gold in there. So basically, the reason I'm asking that, I've got access to almost 20 million tons of this material. So that's why I've been asking Mark that question. What is the interest in investing in gold in South Africa? And I'm working in South Africa as well as in West Africa. In West Africa, I'm doing gold, but I just brought in that question because this is something that I'm seeing that is a low-hanging fruit, and then getting proper investments into that.
If I could answer that, Wardell Armstrong, we are the only independent, privately owned lab in the UK. So we do both pilot and bench scale test work. So it's something we could perhaps talk to you offline about and give you a proposal and maybe do some testing. But it is one of those things you have to, you know, get all that test work done correct at the start. Make sure you've had, as I said, if you've got 20 million tons, you know, you're going to make sure you've sampled it properly to get a representative sample. It's no good just testing a high grade area and thinking that will apply to the whole of it, or the medium or low grade. But as you said, people have been looking at these for a while, and was it the Ergo plants in South Africa? They did process some of them, and the other interesting thing about some of these old gold plants, once you've processed the ore, the real estate can be very valuable as well. So it can be a double positive. But yeah, happy to talk to you offline or whatever and see if we can help you with the processing side of things. But yeah, it could take more than one go at it to get it right, shall we say.
Thank you, Mark.
Excellent. All right, so I think we're 20 minutes over time. I guess
as all the best ones are.
So true. Again, guys, register for our Zimbabwe webinar on Thursday. We'll send out the invite to you shortly. And thank you for joining us today.
Great.
Thanks.
Cheers,
Thanks,
guys.
Mark. Thanks,
Cheers.
bye.
Thanks, right.